So one of the main causes of anxiety can be relationships, whether it's romantic, social, or with family. No one can trigger you like a close-knit relationship. So we wanted to bring in a specialist who not only specializes in relationships as an LMFT, but he also specializes in working with anxious adults, and that's why we brought him in. So we want to thank so much for him coming by, Dr. Andy Melton of Melton Counseling. Andy, thank you so much for being here.
Hey, thank you, Jim. I'm glad to be here.
This is awesome. So his practice is in East Nashville, but he does take clients remotely. And you said you specialize in disconnected couples, restless entrepreneurs, and anxious adults, which at our company, Inner Solutions, we've got all three in the two of us.
Right on.
Yeah, so this is fantastic.
There's typically some overlap there with some of that, but yeah, it's been a cool ride over the last 5 years or so. To specialize. Some of those specializations I sought after, and some of them found me.
Nice. Yeah.
But it's been good.
Yeah. Nashville has an amazing entrepreneur scene. There's tons of self-starters. There's a huge entrepreneur center. Can you talk a little bit just about what kind of some of the specialization working with what you call restless entrepreneurs? I love that term.
Yeah, I that's one that found me after several years of doing my work. East Nashville in particular, Nashville as a whole, but especially in East Nashville, you've got lots of people, whether they're owners and operators, startups, executives. You've just got lots of people who are blazing a trail in their career field in whatever way. It's interesting. I've learned through the years that the entrepreneurial lifestyle is synonymous with manic depression. Okay, so lots of high highs, lots of low lows, and a lot of these men and women out there doing the work, they don't get that, or at least they don't pay attention to the emotional experience of being an entrepreneur. A quick example of this: I went to a conference, and after the workshop was done, the person was pitching a new tech project for my profession, and I waited in line to be able to talk with her because I knew she was an entrepreneur and just wanted to check in with her and let her know I do what I do. And I was the last person to talk with her. People were filtering out of the room. I ended up handing her my card, and I said, "Hey, I'm a clinician, a counselor who specializes in working with entrepreneurs, or what I call restless entrepreneurs." And man, her countenance fell, and she just sort of said, "Oh, thank you. Oh my word." She said, "I was up at 4 this morning switching money around just to get here. I didn't even know if I would be here for this conference." It's just a tough lifestyle, lots of emotional volatility. And so it's really cool to be able to specialize in that community and work with these fine men and women who are out there doing the work.
That's so great. And I love pivoting into your other two specialities, which is disconnected couples and anxious adults. What we're going to talk about today is just those two perfectly. So I want to start with a huge move, a big question, which is, as a doctor, as a counselor and expert, do you have relationship and family issues, even as the expert?
100%. Yeah, absolutely. So on the emotional side, absolutely. The anxiety actually runs in my family. And so we, holiday meals, we chew the fat on, hey, how's that going? How's that internal or the external effects of anxiety going? Got a lot of mental health professionals in my family, as it were. So yeah, there's that part, the internal world, absolutely. And then yes, on the relationship side, family and whether it's extended family or my nuclear family, my wife, my kids, yeah, there's issues to go around. And just because I work in the field I do, or I'm considered an expert in what I do, it's real life. Relationships are real life. I was just having this conversation yesterday that relationships are a mystery, and they're not formulaic, right? It's not as easy as A plus B plus C equals D. it really is a mystery. And I believe that's kind of by design, honestly. I think it's what keeps relationships thriving over a lifetime. So I think it's amazing, but it's also very complex.
Wow. Well, so what inspired you to become an LMFT? And then furthermore, once you went through that grueling masters and practicum and everything, what was the inspiration or motivation to work towards your PhD?
Yeah, so I'm actually an LPC. LMFT is a different lane in the mental health
Okay.
interstate there.
I see.
I'm a licensed professional counselor here in Tennessee. We call them LPC MHSPs. But yeah, I went down that line. In fact, my master's degree is in both marriage and family therapy. So I could have gone for that license, but it was in both professional counseling and marriage and family therapy. Yeah, you get through all that, and as you said, it's an intense educational experience. And it was a few years after my master's where I had the opportunity to supervise some bachelor level case managers. If you're familiar with case management, it's a tough job.
Yeah.
It's usually a second shift job. It's usually psychology majors out of college go into case management. It's not easy, and I got to supervise these young men and women, and that became the favorite part of my job. And I came home one day and told my wife, Crystal, I just said, I think I want to do this. I love working with clients, but I think I want to help the up and coming generations of mental health professionals to excel. And so that's what motivated me to go get my doctorate.
Can you talk about that? What were some of the key parts of the supervision of caseworkers? By caseworkers, by the way, do you mean they were going in to be social workers, like work? Is there a difference between a caseworker and a social worker?
There is, yes.
Okay.
A social worker is its own. It's a master's level position. It's its own license. And so if you're familiar with a LCSW or a licensed clinical social worker, that's a social work degree, and that is a versatile license. If anyone in your audience is thinking about a career in mental health, LCSW is an awesome license to get because it's so versatile. You can do all kinds of things with it. The case managers that I'm referring to are bachelor level graduates. They come out. They don't have any particular licensing or certification, but they get picked up by, say, a local mental health agency or hospital to be a case manager. Case management typically looks like, say, 3 times a week you go into an adolescent's home and work with them on coping skills.
Got you.
Things like that. And so it's hard work. You're in the trenches.
Yeah, definitely. So what was the part of supervision that you enjoyed so much working with the caseworkers?
Oh man, it was so, they were working their tails off to add value to their clients' lives. These young, for them, it was mostly children, adolescents, and their families. And so they would come into my office, and at the time, I'm still young in my career, but they come into my office just needing to relate with someone, needing somebody to, discuss the ins and outs of the work they're doing, to give them, to co-construct some new ideas on, how to work with their clientele and their caseload. And just week in, week out of working with them just motivated me so much because it really was. It was taking good care of the people who are taking good care of people, right? So it's kind of a level up.
Yeah.
And so I indirectly was able to influence several families I would have never had the time to see. And now these young case managers, most of them have gone on and gotten more education, and now they're licensed clinicians. But yeah, it was exciting stuff.
It's amazing. You're a colonel for the mental health army in that kind of situation. It's so cool.
Yeah, exactly.
That's so cool. So pivoting into client work and even into your supervision work, can you kind of distill down what you mainly do with clients during sessions?
Yeah, you bet. So now, are you looking through the lens of anxiety or just generally?
It's a big question. Let's start with anxiety particularly, because that's most of our audience
Okay.
is an anxious audience.
You bet. You bet. So yeah, it depends. I mean, the answer to everything is it depends.
Right.
But it really does. You meet for an intake session, right? Which can be a session or two where you're gathering information, as the clinician is, and the excuse me, and the client is usually very motivated, but as we have already discussed, they're also very anxious, and not just anxious because they deal with anxiety. They're also anxious because they're sitting across from somebody they've never met,
Right.
and they're getting ready to sort of soul vomit here. They're getting ready to tell their story to this strange new person. So I always tell my clients first thing, I say, you are taking a risk by being here, and I think that is so cool, and I'm grateful that you'd be willing to do that. So that those first few sessions are not only gathering information, but it's also rapport building and starting, to build a little bit of trust and sorry,
You're good.
and a foundation for a foundation for the rest of the work. Then after that intake process of 2 or 3 sessions, there are goals that are developed, and these are unique to each person. Now, as you might guess, different counselors have different styles and theory bases. But for me, my goal is to co-construct with my clients a list of um, experiences or behaviors or thought or emotional changes that they want to accomplish by engaging in the counseling process. And so we'll work on that sometimes for a session or two. We'll work on defining what it is they want to accomplish. And those are trajectory setting moments for the counseling, which then send us into, say, session 3 or 4 or 5. And we start moving in on each one of those goals that they set out. And it depends on what the goal is as far as the specific strategies and theories that are used. But generally, that's kind of the launching point for the counseling process.
And do you have, a favorite model or the methods in working with anxiety? I know we're talking pretty generally, but there's definitely some universal symptoms, universal processes. Is there kind of a recipe to your counseling stew, if you will?
Absolutely. Yeah. So every counselor is different. Every counselor has a different theory base, different style. As you'll hear a lot of counselors are what they would say eclectic, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they have lots of, the stew is
Right tool for the right job.
is complex. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so anxiety and panic, there's a few really great tools for the job that most counselors turn to. CBT being one of them. Cognitive behavioral therapy is great because it helps sort of slow down some of those cognitions and take out some of the less effective cognition, thoughts and emotions, and input or replace them with more effective thoughts and emotions. For me, I'm also a solution focused clinician as well. And so a lot of my work is strengths based and solution focused. And so when I have an anxious person sitting across from me, I like to find out where in their life are they getting it right, even if it's just the smallest thing, right? And then being able to focus on that and maybe generalize those strengths to other areas of their life where maybe they're not quite, where they want to be.
Beautiful. Wow. I want to pivot into couples work because you did, even though didn't get the license, you did study the family and couples therapy.
That's right.
So pivoting into that, what are some of the most common issues you see when working with couples?
Yeah. So, conflict, communication, those are sort of your the low hanging fruit of sorts. A couple comes in and they're just like, we can't get along.
Mm-hmm.
We try. There's super high stress in the home or in the relationship, and they've talked about it 1,000 times and just can't quite, get where they want to go. So conflict resolution, communication skills, those are kind of, they're a major part that weaves into all of couples counseling, I believe. Beyond that, it depends on the couple. It depends on the presenting issues. A lot of times, couples have stressed relations with family members, for example, in-laws or siblings, or maybe parenting issues that are stressing the relationship. A lot of times, career problems can put stress on the relationship. And then other times, there's other elements that are introduced into the relationship that are unhealthy. For example, alcohol, drugs, pornography, things that, in moderation, maybe they're not so bad, but for some people, they get to an extreme level and it really damages the relationship. And then certainly outside relationships, especially if it's not a blatantly open relationship, outside relationships, emotional attachments with others outside the relationship, or physical attachments, sexual attachments can be very toxic for relationships.
Yeah, very, very eclectic, very across the board. Have you ever had a couple, that you recommended, maybe not recommended, but in the back of your head figured these people should really break up? And how do you handle that if there's just a really toxic dynamic, or you have this smorgasbord of issues that you just talked about? If it just seems like it's too far gone, what do you do?
It's a great question, and I think every couples counselor has to wrestle with that question that you just asked. So I think that question evolves over time. A green or young counselor might handle a certain way. An experienced counselor might handle it a different way. It also depends on your theory base. For me, I've mentioned the word a few times, co-construction. I am a client-centered co-constructionist in my theory bases, which therefore means that I'm more indirect or one-down approach to my counselors, or forgive me, to my clients, which means that I feel like I'm doing my client well, or doing them the best service if I am a persistent, curious, great question asker, right? That gets them thinking and moving. And so sometimes I'll be more direct, but most of the time, what I'm wanting to do is co-construct with them a solution to whatever the problem is. And if it's a toxic relationship that really they need probably a separation, maybe a structured separation, or maybe they decide that they want a full-on divorce and to go in separate ways. I want, rather than to just tell them straight up, hey, this is toxic, you got to go, something's got to change. My style is more to, talk with them in conversation, and out of that conversation comes hopefully a co-constructed view, and many times does, where they come to that conclusion. And the truth is, if my client comes to the conclusion, it's much more likely that they'll follow through with whatever solution they find, right? As opposed to me sort of offering up a particular solution or intervention.
Got you. So through the kind of the curiosity and the conversation, you're just, are you consciously leading them to a place, or are you just prodding at places that kind of provoke you as far as curiosity, or where you might see some kind of internal conflict for them?
Yeah, you try not to lead. I really want us to lead each other.
Right.
That's kind of my overall goal. Now, that might be a little utopian.
Sure.
That might be a little ideal.
We have to. We're idealistic. That's what we live.
Yeah.
Hope is our product, man. We sell hope.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. But yeah, I mean, I hope they come to that conclusion on their own, and I try not to be too leading. But, there have been times I've worked with hundreds. I might be up over 1,000 couples in the last 15 years now.
Wow.
But, there are times when it is just very clear that they're in a toxic situation and something needs to change. And so some of my assessments, will show that, so I'll give them some assessments that let them know that clearly something's off. And then other times, like I said before, other times I'm a little more direct, and I'll just kind of say, heads up, hey, I'm seeing something here. You're telling me this, but I'm seeing this, and they don't match up. Help me understand, what's going on with you. So sometimes a little more direct, but most of the time I try to keep it as level as I can so that they're coming to a conclusion. And I tell you, it's pretty awesome. They'll come, it'll be a session 7 or 9 or whatever, and they'll come in and they'll say, you remember what you told me, Dr. Melton, back in session 4?
Yeah.
And it was so helpful. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful, right? And you get it. Like, I didn't say that. I never said the exact words they thought they heard.
Right.
They said it and they took it and it was helpful.
Yeah, definitely. Pivoting off of what you were saying, a lot of the clients that we work with one-on-one, they're in unhealthy dynamics, but they also might have some skewed thinking about who's to blame, some self-victimization. Can you talk about what emotional abuse is and how someone could identify if they're in an emotionally abusive relationship? Because that term, I feel like, has such a wide spectrum. It would help to have an expert, boil it down for us.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the term itself, emotion, is such a complex term. It's hard to put your finger on it, right? And even if we identify a particular emotion, say fear, if we put 10 people in a room, ask them to define fear, we're very likely to get 10 different answers, right? So it's just a very intangible concept. Emotions are anyway. And so your question is a great one. It's like, how do you know?
Right.
How do you know if you're in a toxic relationship? How do you know if you're in an emotionally abusive situation? So there's some things to be looking for that you can kind of check the boxes a little bit and say, okay, I think these are them. One of those is intimidation, from one person to another. If one person is sort of metaphorically towering over another person, then that can be a sign. If someone is threatening, say physical harm, not just to the partner, but they might be threatening the physical harm to themselves in order to get a certain behavior or response from the other person.
Wow.
They might be threatening harm to other people or other family members, which sounds so malicious, and it is. But when people are trying to describe those things, sometimes they're not direct. They're more passive threats, right? And it's hard to put your finger on it.
Yeah.
Another thing is destruction of like property, or say abuse of pets or something like that, where that person is manipulating the other person, the partner, by destruction of certain property or harming a pet. Finally, I'd say like forcing isolation, right? So forcing the partner, say if it's emotionally abusive, to force that other person to isolate against their will, or for you as the emotionally abusive person to isolate yourself as somehow a punishment or a consequence. So there's probably more, but those are a few of the boxes to check if you're wondering, hey, am I in one of those types of relationships?
Yeah, and I love the word you use, manipulation. It sounds like that's the kind of the thread that binds those together. Different types of manipulation, direct and indirect. Yeah, wow.
And I think it's important too, Jim, that manipulation isn't always cognizant.
Yes.
Or they don't always know they're doing it. Right. So it's not always a clear sort of good guy and bad guy.
Right.
Sometimes the bad guy doesn't know they're the bad guy, and that's a very complex situation, of course.
That's deep. So the LMFT, there's also the family aspect. What are some key differences you see in as far as issues between families and couples?
As far as like between the two,
No,
certain issues families have and
kind of
certain
like
issues couples have, or
differences you find in maybe treating families versus couples.
yeah. So, well, the first, most blatant difference is, partners you choose, family you don't. You know,
Yeah.
family is chosen for
Yeah.
you way before you're able to make decisions for yourself, right? So that presents a major, difference
Mm,
in issues you might have with a voluntary partner versus issues you have with a family member who you
right.
didn't choose and they didn't choose you. So that's a big thing, but a lot of the relational issues, especially, and a major factor here is under the same roof stuff,
Hmm.
right? So if it's a family under the same roof, uh, there's going to be some similar issues that maybe a couple has if they're under the same roof, for
Right.
example. But if it's extended family or family that does not live under your same roof, those issues might look different for sure.
Got you. And so why is it true? Because I mean, I'm 35. I've known this for years that just no matter how much time goes by, there's just no one that can trigger you like your family.
Yeah,
Why is
yeah,
that?
no kidding.
There's no one that can trigger you like your family. Maybe a
No one,
romantic partner, but
right? Yeah, and the key word to that, I believe it's uh well, intimacy. Maybe that's the
mm,
key word, but they know you. They know you better than anybody on the planet. They know you better than you know yourself,
mm,
right? And so for them to say that just right thing that they know is going to push your buttons, right? That's going to get underneath and make your skin crawl. And romantic partners and spouses can certainly do that too. I mean, you just know each other so well that it doesn't take much at all uh, to uh, to light your fire, to get your buttons pushed. I also think, we talk about getting deep, but I also think that we see ourselves in our family members. We see
mm,
ourselves in our spouses, right? So many times when a family member or a spouse says something that's hurtful or digs deep, we have a hard time distinguishing, like, is that my thought of myself or is that someone else's thought of me?
mm.
And that can create all kinds of fun complexity in internal complexity.
Yeah. So we have a large client base that might be beaten down by anxiety or heavy panic attacks. They might end up back closer with and relying on their family because their professional lives tend to disintegrate a little bit, their social lives tend to disintegrate, and their romantic lives. What are
Mhm.
some of the key elements you found working with anxious adults that are absolutely paramount in shifting familial relationships so that they are less triggering?
Yeah, you bet. So it's a great question. The first word that comes to mind is safety, right? If
Mm,
you don't feel safe with this other person, whether they're a family member or a spouse or whatever, a partner, uh, if you don't feel safe, then you're going to be triggered much more often, right?
right.
So the way I like to conceptualize this for me, just to make sense to myself, is when those times happen. Let's say that there's conflict and there's a lot of triggering going on as far as anxiety or those kinds of things, fears. You've got a couple of options. You can either move toward or move away, right?
Mm, yeah.
And if you're going to move toward that, either way, you're trying to seek safety, right? And so if you're moving toward, that's a good thing. In fact, that's ideal. If you've got a family member that is triggering you and you just feel all kinds of anxious around them, ideally you can increase communication with them, you increase emotional intimacy with them, you can discuss what's going on, you can talk about what you're feeling on a meta level and have them kind of speak into that. Hopefully, if that happens, then a step toward each other takes place, more safety takes
Mm,
place, which allows then less triggering. That's not always possible, right? We can't control that other person. Maybe they're not open to taking a step toward us. Maybe they're not open to more communication. And so then sometimes the safest thing to do is to put some distance between you. And that doesn't necessarily mean you don't talk for 6 months. You might still be under the same roof. You might still be, visiting regularly, but there can be sometimes a safety that's created by a little either internal distance where you kind of change your perspective on things and you're kind of like, oh, I'm not going to take things as personal. I'm going to be appropriately indifferent on some things here.
Yeah.
Right. And then sometimes it's external distance, right? Where you just literally have to like, I'm not going to be around them as much. So either step in can create safety if the circumstances are right, but sometimes a step away creates that safety that hopefully will create safety down the road to be able to, step back towards each other.
Wow. Yeah. What are some of the best practices that people can implement that will lead to better relationships with either their family or spouse? Stuff, practical stuff that you encourage clients to do on their own, beyond seeing a therapist or a coach.
Yeah. And seeing a therapist and a coach is always a good thing, but not just because they're knowledgeable, right? So it is at its very core, coaching and counseling, at the very core, it's involving someone else who's not emotionally connected to your world in any way, right? Family or friends or any of it. And that alone can be big, right?
Yeah.
And so a lot of my clients, I'll say, they'll kind of feel the stigma of mental health, right? And they'll come in and they'll be anxious or nervous about the situation. I'll say, hey, right now I'm just somebody who's not part of your world. And that alone, you bouncing things off of me, that alone can be a really helpful thing.
Absolutely.
Now, some of these other, as your question asked, some of the other activities or experiences, is increasing communication, but putting boundaries around that communication. So an example of that might be, say, hey, we're going to talk about our relationship, because strangely enough, lots of people do not, right? They want it to get better, but they don't talk about it unless they're arguing. And so, or unless they're elevated. And so planning times to talk about your relationship can be a really good thing. For example, putting it on the calendar Tuesday nights at 8:30. Every Tuesday night at 8:30, we're going to sit down, we're going to chat about our relationship for 30 minutes or whatever. And outside of that, we're not going to try to solve any problems. We're just going to live life, but we're going to reserve that time. What that does is it puts boundaries around a conversation. It also helps both people prepare their thoughts and emotions for that situation or that conversation. So that can be a really practical way. There's lots there to help improve communication skills and conflict resolution skills. But that's one example.
Nice. I want to get your thoughts on something. So typically in this kind of family and dealing with anxious adults, typically there's a dynamic of the anxious client is either suffering in silence, or they feel like that's all they can talk about is their anxiety because it's so overwhelming, and that they don't feel so connected to, their spouse or their family or whoever they're trying to share with, that they just can't understand and they feel isolated. How would you advise somebody who comes to you and has that feeling that they're just, suffering, feel so alone in their suffering and nobody understands, and feel isolated, which in turn can intensify the anxiety?
Yeah, that's a tough thing. Loneliness and the feeling of isolation, especially in 2020, is just so rampant. It's everywhere. But it hasn't just been 2020. It's been something our culture has been moving toward for quite a while. In fact, just a few years ago, the UK implemented a new national position they call the Ministry of Loneliness. And they actually have a minister of loneliness.
Wow.
that yeah, that attempts to decrease the loneliness that the nation, because it's running rampant.
That's amazing. Could you
Isn't that
imagine
interesting?
America
Yeah,
coming up with something like
yeah,
that? Yeah, the
yeah.
Secretary of Loneliness.
Exactly, exactly. Well, it's a thing, and we could talk technology and social media and that whole
Yeah.
thing, which is sort of a pseudo intimacy, right? It's not real, but we pursue it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, loneliness is a real thing. And as far as, somebody coming to me and saying, man, I'm feeling this and I'm really looking to get connected. Now, let me ask a follow-up question for you. Are they wanting to connect with, say, a spouse or family member? Or are you more just talking general loneliness?
I think I'm specifically about, I've dealt with quite a few clients who struggle with, they just feel like nobody understands what I'm going through. Like I'm just, with high anxiety, nobody understands. I'm kind of living in fear, and that feels a little more isolative for them. And so again, that can kind of exacerbate their feedback loop of anxiety and just cultivating more fear and more stress.
Yeah.
What sort of, where would you start with them as far as if somebody came to you with that? My parents just don't understand. Like they tell me just to get better. They tell me just to get, that it's all in my head. What do you say to console them, or pieces of advice you'd give them to move in a direction? How would you handle a case like that?
Yeah, it's complex. It
Yeah.
really is. I think, it starts with awareness, and every client's a
Mm.
little different on what they're aware of, and but that loneliness often leads to fear. Fear is sort of, you know, fear and anxiety kind of go hand in hand. Anxiety, I often say, is just kind of a fancy word for fear,
Mm-hmm.
but when somebody's feeling lonely, oftentimes it's paired with fear of, am I not loved? Am I not cared for?
Mm.
Am I going to be alone in the long stretch,
Right.
in the
Right.
long haul? And so awareness of which emotions are being triggered by that loneliness. Obviously, sadness can be as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but to understand their fears and insecurities that could be contributing in some indirect way, could be contributing to the loneliness,
Yeah.
in it of itself. And
Yeah.
so awareness is a great place to start. Of, okay, what sort of fears do you have? And sometimes I'll do a sentence completion with my clients where I'll say, I feel most lonely when, and then I'll have them finish that sentence maybe 25 times or so with different thoughts and ideas.
Wow.
Um, and then you might follow that up with, I feel most insecure or fearful when, right? And a lot of those thoughts are probably going to overlap a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that awareness can be huge. So that's kind of an internal intervention, if you will,
Yeah.
to sort of find that out. And then you can start looking, after the awareness is there, you can start looking at external interventions to say, okay, what steps can you take? And this is usually different for every client, but what steps can you take to decrease that feeling of loneliness, increase connection with other human beings, whether it's family or spouse or whatever?
Yeah, I love that. I love getting really specific about, this kind of inner ball of chaotic emotions and just being like, yeah, I feel isolated when, or I feel lonely when. Just
Yeah,
because once you feel like you get that specific thought in there, it's a hell of a lot easier to address it.
that's right.
So yeah, that's a really beautiful exercise. Do you have any resources that you recommend to clients looking to understand and evolve their relationships, whether it's, with themselves, with their parents, with their spouses, books, websites, YouTube channels, anything like that you recommend?
Yeah, you bet. You know, it's there's so much out there, right? And so Googling some of these resources,
Yeah.
you never know what you're quite going to get. So
Yeah.
you definitely want to ask around,
That's
right?
why we're
And
asking
find
you.
out.
That's why they're asking the expert, man.
That's right. That's right. A couple of the things that I go to, Henry Cloud and John Townsend have written books for years called the Boundaries series.
Mm.
And if you're familiar with that at all, but it's a great, different books sort of focus on, different styles of relationship, whether it be family or romantic. But
Mm-hmm.
the book itself, called Boundaries, just simply called Boundaries, is a great overview of what it looks like to take a relationship from a toxic point, or where both people feel lonely or both people feel conflicted, to a place of safety and health. And that could be, like I say, any style of relationship, maybe a friendship. And so that book is great. There's a lot a lot of information in there.
Mm-hmm.
Another resource, John Gottman is an excellent researcher and writer. He's done lots of stuff. One of the books I'd recommend from him is called The Relationship Cure. And it is not written to the marriage or romantic relationship. It is actually written more for friends and family. So it does a really good job at discussing those types of relationships. As far as websites, there's a couple of those. The Couple Connection, Tammy Lynn edits that website, but it's just a ton of great information. Another is called Life and Love Toolbox.com.
Nice.
And by the way, the Couple Connection is a .net, just so you know.
Got you. Perfect.
But lifeandlovetoolbox.com, Lisa Brooks edits that, and that is again just sort of huge conglomerate of all kinds of information on relationships and the different styles of relationships.
It's amazing. I mean, coming to a close here, is there any notes you want to give people? Any just general pieces of advice? Anything that you've seen that's common right now related to the time we're at in 2020 or towards the holidays, or anything you want to share with our audience?
Yeah, sure. So big picture, assess the severity of the fears you're feeling and the anxieties you're feeling, right? So you can do that with a professional or a coach, say, a dude like you, Jim. You can do that with a counselor like myself, but you can also do that on your own, is sort of assess that severity and say, is more what am I feeling more of a fear, more anxiety, more panic, and you kind of start to, the more aware you are of those severities, the better. Once you know sort of some of the things that you can control and some things you can't, that can be very helpful as well. So that's kind of big picture. Obviously, consult with your PCP if you're having some physical symptomology related to your anxiety or your panic. Consult with your PCP, rule out some possible other contributors. Consider medications, but be careful with that. That's a ball of what do you say? A can of worms. Medications can be.
Yeah.
So that's big picture. Let me give you the small picture. Let me give you just a few tangible things for the anxiety sort of tool belt. Okay?
Please, thank you.
Very practically, one I love to talk about is called the 4-second breathe box. Okay, and so breathing and deep breathing, diaphragmatic breathing, we hear about these a lot, and there's good reason for it. Is because when we're anxious, in some sense, we're kind of stuck in our fears. We're stuck almost in the future, if you will. Breathing and paying attention to our breathing can help bring us back into the present, where we were designed to live, right here, right now. Jim, you and I are talking right here. We are in this moment together. Well, anxious people, and myself included, when I feel anxious, I'm not right here, right now. I'm stuck, 2 days from now or 10 days from now on some worry that I have. So 4-second breathe box is simply drawing a box with your hand, and each side of the box is a different activity. So the first side is breathing in for 4 seconds. The top of the box is holding your breath for 4 seconds. The other side of the box is breathing out slowly for 4 seconds. And then the bottom of the box is just breathing normally or resting. And so to be able to do that, if you're in a crowd, you don't have to use your hand. You don't want to be looked at.
You're dancing and breathing at the same time.
Exactly. But otherwise, it can be useful to use your hand because you're just involving your body, you're involving your senses to try to bring yourself in to the moment. Two others that I'll mention real quickly: a sensory scan. Go through all 5 senses. Notice the different, notice 4 things from each sense. So notice 4 things you hear, 4 things you see, 4 things you smell. Again, those are helping you bring yourself back into the now, because anxiety gets you stuck in the future. Finally, a body scan. Sometimes it's called a muscle, progressive muscle relaxation. But it's basically when you start at the bottom of your feet and you engage your first muscle group, which is your toes. You hold for 4 seconds and release. Do it again for 4 seconds and release. You move up your body to the different, your ankles, your calves, your quads, everything else. And you engage that muscle group for 4 seconds and release all the way up to the top of your head. And that again is another technique of bringing yourself back into the now.
It's amazing, man. It's amazing. Guys, you can find him at meltoncounseling.com. Andy Melton, LPC, PhD, practicing in East Nashville, specializing in disconnected couples, restless entrepreneurs, and anxious adults. No Instagram, which is totally fine. I dig that about you. Andy, this has been amazing for me, just to be able to pick the mind of an expert, and this is going to be incredibly useful for our audience. And I just can't say thank you enough for spending your valuable time sharing with us. And yeah, lots of luck and lots of love for you and your practice. And we hope you'll come back maybe on a live stream sometime, or maybe do a group coaching class.
Hey, I'm all for it.
We're wheeling them in, man. We got them stuck. Andy, thank you so much, my man, and I appreciate it. And the rest of you guys, remember, no matter where you are, no matter how long you've been struggling or how intense it is, you're never stuck. You might just need some support from somebody like Andy. So lots of love to you guys and good mental health.